Hello Year 9, it's Mr. Sandbrook here. I'm going to be teaching you today in the last lesson in our unit of work on the British sector of the Western Front. Our lesson today is how do historians analyse sources about the Western Front. So we're going to pull together everything that we've learnt about the period itself and the sources of evidence that we can use to study it to tackle some exam style questions. So before we start, let's get ready. Make sure you've got your workbook with you, that you've got something to write with, that you've got some scrap paper just to jot down any rough ideas, and that all potential distractions are well out of the way. So just hit pause now and make sure you're completely set up for the lesson. So a slightly different do now today. What I'd like you to do before we start our main activities is have a good read over of your knowledge organiser, because we're going to use a lot of your contextual knowledge today to come up with some really high quality responses. So just pause the video now and have a good check through your knowledge organiser. So, how do historians analyse sources about the Western Front? What we're going to do is we'll analyse some contemporary sources. We're going to build an inquiry into the Western Front. And by doing that, we're then going to produce two exam style answers to questions. So before we try to answer those questions, let's see how to do it. Firstly, analysing how useful sources are. So before we even read the source or look at the photograph's content, if it's a picture, we need to do some work on the caption. So what I'd like you to do in all the captions that you get every time you get a source on the First World War in an assessment is I'd like you to underline the type of source, the author, the topic, the date, and the location of the source. When you've done that, you can then have a look at the content of the source, and as you're reading through or looking at the photo or looking at the picture, you can underline and make quick notes and label any notable phrases or content. So have a go at that for source A. Work on the caption and then see if you can notice anything in the photograph itself of the casualty clearing station, things that you think might be of importance. So here's what I've got. I've shown that it's a photograph at a casualty clearing station, and it comes from circa, that means roughly 1916. Remember, anytime you see that little C before a date, that means roughly for us as historians. And then on the photograph itself, I've noticed that the casualty clearing station is actually a big tent or a marquee. I've noticed that we've got some nurses working. They seem to be bandaging wounds. I can see though, there's lots of different injuries for them to work on. Some of the soldiers have got wounded faces, or arms, or feet, or legs. There's all sorts of different injuries being dealt with. And my last thing I've noticed is that they're outside. I'm not sure it's mud, but it certainly doesn't look particularly clean, so I've just jotted down the word mud, and that might be of use to me later in an inquiry. So just see if you can add any of those to your own copy of the photograph. So our first type of question is where we analyse how useful a source is for a particular inquiry. Now when we answer these questions, our answer splits into two paragraphs. We do one paragraph for each source, and then within that, each paragraph has three sections. The first section, we talk about the content of the source, the stuff we can actually see. Secondly, we then discuss the provenance of the source and how that affects the usefulness of the source for the inquiry that we have. Now, to do both of those successfully, we pull in our knowledge as historians. I'll show you how that works in a moment. And the last part of our paragraph will be a short statement of decision. And we repeat that for each source that appears in our question. Each source gets its own turn. In the real exam, we're going to have two sources in these questions, but for our practice we're just going to work on one. But this doesn't matter too much, because we would just simply repeat the steps all over again, because each paragraph is for each source. We don't combine the sources in them, and we try to be as concise as we can. So here's an example of the first half of a paragraph. Our question is, how useful is source A for an inquiry into the treatment of battle injuries by medical staff? What you can do is to use that as the first sentence of your answer to make sure that your writing is particularly relevant. And then what you need to do is to pick out one or two pieces of information or quotations from the source that you've noticed and put them in context. Develop them with your own knowledge. And you might be able to see that I've tried to do that in this example. So I've said I've noticed that there are some nurses working at the casualty clearing station, and I've developed that with my own knowledge. I've said that these are nurses from FANY, from the Field Army Nursing Yeomanry. And I know, as a historian, that they would sometimes administer dressings, and they'd clean wounds, they'd do general nursing work. A great idea is to talk about how typical the information in the source is. And again, you can only do that if you've got your own historical knowledge to bring. So we're halfway through our paragraph. Our next job is to discuss how the provenance of the source affects how useful it is for our inquiry. Now, to do this, we can consider the source's nature, origin, and purpose, how typical it is of what was happening on the Western Front at the time. Now, we don't need to discuss all of these things. We don't work through each of those in turn. You just pick the one or ones that are most useful for you. I've tried to show you this working in this example. So I'm saying, okay, it's a photograph. Now there's a problem there, because yes, photographs give us a snapshot, but it might not be typical. It's also limited in its range. Now I know that by this stage in the war, casualty clearing stations were really quite advanced, often having X-ray units, that kind of thing. Whereas our photograph suggests that they were much more basic. So it might not be completely typical of what was going on the Western Front at that time. So you can see we don't need to discuss every aspect of provenance. We just pick on the ones that stand out to us. So we're nearly there. The last thing we need to do in our paragraph is a very straightforward and concise decision, summarising how useful the source is. And this can be just a straightforward statement like you can see here. Now remember, in a real exam question, we'd have to repeat all of that for another source. We'd give each source its own paragraph. So for each source, we discuss the content, we discuss the provenance, and then a short decision, and we're done. Okay, our second type of exam question for us to have a look at is making a historical inquiry. Now this will come up in your final GCSE exam. And the topic of this inquiry will follow on from the question that we've just done. So in this case, it's an inquiry into the treatment of battle wounds by medical staff on the Western Front. And you'll be asked 4 short tasks. But they follow on from each other, so it's a great idea to work them all out before you start writing up. You'll be asked to find a detail in a source that you would follow up, a question that you would ask, the type of source that you could use to answer this question, and then a brief explanation of how that would help you to answer your question. So let's look at each of those in turn. Firstly, identify a specific detail from the source. Now this is most easily done. In written sources, you just need to write a quote. You just lift relevant words that you're going to take and develop in your other sections of the answer and jot them down. That's all you need to do. Now, of course, in a photograph or a picture, you can't do that. So you describe something from the photograph that you're going to develop or follow up. So I've gone for this. The dressing of wounds is being done in the open on a muddy field. Okay, your second task will be a question that you would ask. Here you need to design your own question. Now it must be relevant. It must link to the inquiry, the treatment of battle wounds by medical staff, and it must link to the detail that you identified in the first section of the answer. A great way around this is to try to broaden the detail. So maybe something like this. Did nurses usually work inside, or was it actually normal for them to work outside in these dirty conditions? So you can start to talk about typicality. That's just one way around this. Your next job is going to identify a source that you might use to help you to answer your question. Now you might remember last lesson we met the different types of contemporary evidence that we have available to us. And we said that you really want to learn those off by heart. This is why you're going to need these at your disposal, so you can pick any of those. But they're going to have to be relevant, and you're going to have to explain your choice in the question that follows. Now lots of people tend to go for a diary, that you'd like a diary to use. Now that's great, but if you're going to do that, you can be really fussy with the type of diary that you would want. So I'm not just going to say I want a nurse's diary. I'm going to say this. I'd like a Fanny nurse's diary from the Somme after the battle had finished. So I'm going to use that to talk about whether or not what was going on was typical. But you can contextualize the sort of evidence that you want, but you have to pick a contemporary source of evidence. You cannot just write the internet or a TV program. It has to come from the Western Front. So our last job will be a short explanation of how the source that you picked will help you to answer the question. Basically, what do you hope to find now? How would you use that source as a historian? Now keep it simple. You won't have a huge space to fill in any answer booklet about this. And this is for just 1 mark. So it can be a straightforward statement. Here's a nice one. It'll show me the typical conditions at casualty clearing stations. So I'll find out how nurses work for most of the war. So you're nearly ready for your main activity. Make sure that you've read all of the resources for the lesson carefully, and you're going to attempt your own usefulness question, and then you're going to attempt your own inquiry. Try to use all the techniques that we've discussed in this video. I've tried to give you a lot of space in your workbook. It might take you slightly longer, so if you need to, just work on spare paper and attach that to the back of your workbook, or maybe just use the back cover. Good luck, see how you go with that. This is a great workout because these questions do come from a past GCSE exam paper, so see how you get on. We'll be really interested to see your work. So we're at the end now. You can take this further though. On our YouTube channel, there's a full set of revision and exam technique tutorials that you can have a look at that go over the British sector of the Western Front unit of work in much more detail. Well done, Year 9. We're at the end of this unit of work. You should have a complete workbook now, full of some great learning. Do keep hold of your workbooks, because we're going to be really interested in having a look at those when you return to school.